The old man couldn't ride a horse. He watched from a litter, carried on the shoulders of servants, unable to mount, as 30,000 of the most feared soldiers in the known world turned their backs on a city they had marched 126 miles to destroy. They weren't retreating from an army. They were retreating from dust. According to Procopius of Caesarea, the only historian who recorded what happened at Satala in the summer of 530, a Byzantine force, roughly half the size of the Persian invasion, turned one of history's most powerful military machines around with a single act of theater. The numbers make no sense. The outcome makes no sense. And one man's decision makes least sense of all. A cavalry officer named Florentius the Thracian, who charged alone into 30,000 enemies to steal a flag. He succeeded. He was killed immediately afterward. The flag's loss broke the Persian army's will entirely. Procopius records this in a single sentence. He names Florentius once. He never mentions him again. What kind of man looks at 30,000 enemies, looks at a flag, and calculates that the trade is worth it? What does a person understand about war? About what actually holds an army together? That makes that calculation seem not just rational, but obvious. The chronicles give us the act. They never give us the man. What Florentius knew, or believed, or felt in that moment has been lost for 1,500 years. By the end of this video, you'll understand 3 things that most accounts of this period miss entirely. You'll discover that the Persian general commanding 30,000 men was physically lame and directed the entire campaign from a litter. And that this detail explains more about why he lost than any tactical analysis does. You'll learn that the Armenian brothers who defected to Sittas after the battle had beaten Sittas himself in combat 3 years earlier, and why their decision to switch sides mattered more than the battle that prompted it. And you'll understand why the gold mines that Persia lost in the aftermath of Satala had caused wars between these two empires 4 separate times across a century, and would cause another war 2 years after the peace treaty that ended this one. To understand why Florentius made the calculation he made, we need to go back 4 years, and the moment a single legal objection in Constantinople made 30,000 men march toward a valley of hills in the Armenian highlands. From the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, from the Nile Delta to the edge of Central Asia, 2 empires had been defining the political architecture of the known world for 3 centuries. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantine, and the Sassanid Persian Empire were not merely rivals in the conventional sense. They were the axis around which everything else turned. Trade routes, religious allegiances, nomadic federations, client kingdoms, the entire diplomatic ecosystem of late antiquity organized itself in relation to these 2 powers and the line that divided them. That line had been stable, roughly, since the Peace of Nisibis in 363. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but stable. Raids, proxy wars, disputed fortresses, the endless negotiation of tribute and prestige. What neither empire had managed in 3 centuries was a decisive, permanent breakthrough. The frontier held because neither side could afford to break it entirely, and both sides knew it. The pressure point was the Transcaucasus, the mountain corridor between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, the territory of modern Georgia and Armenia, was not simply contested land. It was the strategic hinge of the entire Roman-Persian confrontation. Whoever controlled the Transcaucasus controlled access to nomadic manpower from the Eurasian steppe, the trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to China and India, and, most critically, the ability to flank the other empire's main defensive line. Persian dominance of the Transcaucasus threatened Constantinople's rear. Roman dominance threatened Ctesiphon's flank. Both empires understood this perfectly, which is why every kingdom, every clan, every petty chieftain in that corridor was perpetually being courted by both sides. By the time Justinian I became emperor in 527, the opening years of the Iberian War had been going badly for Rome. The historian Geoffrey Greatrix, in his study of this period, notes that the early fighting had favored Persia systematically. The Iberian revolt had been crushed by 527. Roman offensive efforts against Nisibis had failed, and Persian forces had pushed into eastern Lazica, extending their reach toward the Black Sea coast. The frontier wasn't holding, it was contracting. Justinian's response was structural rather than merely military. He recognized that the Armenian theater, geographically distinct from the Mesopotamian front where Belisarius operated, was being undermined by fragmented command. Different generals, different priorities, no unified doctrine. His solution was to create an entirely new office, the Magister Militum per Armenium, the Master of Soldiers for Armenia, with consolidated authority over the entire northern theater. This was not simply a promotion. It was an acknowledgement that Armenia required a different kind of war, fought by a different kind of general. The man Justinian chose for that office, and the man who would stand at Satala 3 years later, had started his career carrying a spear in someone else's bodyguard. The most powerful military machine of the ancient Near East was still winning when Justinian reorganized his armies. The reforms hadn't been tested. The new command structure hadn't been validated. The question was whether the man holding the title could make the doctrine work before Persia's momentum became irreversible. What neither Justinian nor his new Armenian commander could fully predict was that the war's catalyst had not been a military decision at all. It had been a diplomatic insult. And the man who delivered it hadn't meant to. In the early 520s, the Shah of Persia was an old man navigating a succession crisis with the care of someone diffusing something explosive. Kavad I had reigned, with one violent interruption, since 488. He had survived a Mazdakite rebellion, a forced abdication, a civil war, and the endless factional maneuvering of Persian court politics. By the time he was approaching the end of his reign, one thing consumed him: ensuring that the right son inherited his throne. The right son was Khosrau. The threat to Khosrau was real. Rival brothers, resurgent Mazdakite factions, the court's perpetual appetite for disruption. Kavath needed Khosrau's legitimacy guaranteed by an outside power whose recognition would be difficult to contest. The outside power he approached was Rome. According to Procopius, who had access to the diplomatic correspondence of this period, Kavad proposed in 524 or 25 that the Roman Emperor Justin I formally adopt Khosrau as a son. The logic was sound. A Roman imperial adoption would give Khosrau a status that transcended Persian factionalism. Justin and his nephew Justinian were initially receptive. The proposal moved forward through official channels. Then Justin's legal advisor, a man named Proclus, killed it. His argument was precise and devastating. A formal Roman legal adoption could give Khosrau a theoretical claim to the Roman throne itself. Whatever Kavath's intentions, the legal mechanism created a future liability Rome could not accept. Justin agreed. He offered an alternative, what Roman law called a *0*a ceremonial exchange of arms, rather than a legal paternity transfer. The message was essentially taxonomic. Khosrau could be adopted as a barbarian ally, not as a Roman heir. Kavad and Khosrau understood the taxonomy perfectly. Rome had just told Persia's future emperor that he was a barbarian, not civilized enough for Roman legal standing. The insult was calculated, or appeared calculated, which for practical purposes was the same thing. Negotiations collapsed. Simultaneously, religious pressure was building in the Caucasus. Procopius records that Kavad had been attempting to force the Christian Iberians, the kingdom occupying what is now eastern Georgia, to adopt Zoroastrian practices. Specifically, the exposure of the dead to birds and dogs rather than Christian burial. For Christian people, this was not a matter of custom, but of fundamental identity. Around 523 or 24, the Iberian king Gorgan revolted and sought Roman protection. Emperor Justin pledged to defend him. The combination was decisive. A failed adoption that had humiliated Persia's future heir, a Christian kingdom defecting to Roman protection, the neighboring kingdom of Lazica shifting its allegiance toward Constantinople. Kavad's sphere of influence in the Caucasus was visibly contracting. The choice before him was either to accept Persian retreat from the entire Transcaucasus or to fight. Kavad chose to fight. By 526, overt warfare had broken out. By 527, when Justin I died and Justinian inherited both the throne and the war, the early years of fighting had already gone badly for Rome. The Iberian revolt had been crushed. Roman offensive efforts had failed. Persian forces were advancing. The irony that historians rarely emphasize. Kavad had initiated this war partly to secure Khosrau's succession. When Kavad died in 531, Khosrau inherited without difficulty. The war Kavad started to protect his son's throne ended up being resolved by that son, who signed the peace treaty that closed it. The man who caused the war and the man who ended it were the same person. But that was still 2 years away. In the spring of 530, Kavad made one more decision. He sent an army into Roman Armenia. For its commander, he chose an old man who couldn't walk. His name, in the original Persian, was Miro. Procopius, writing in Greek, called him Mermeros. Modern scholars identify him as the Sassanid noble Shapur Mihran, a member of one of the great military houses of the Persian aristocracy, the Mihran family, whose men had been filling senior command roles in the Persian military for generations. He was old, he was experienced, and according to Procopius, he was lame, physically incapable of riding a horse. He directed the entire campaign from a litter. This detail could easily be read as a handicap. It wasn't. Miro had been chosen specifically for the Armenian campaign because of what he knew, not what he could do physically. He was a specialist in siegecraft and in the management of nomadic auxiliaries. Precisely the two skills that mattered most for an invasion of the Armenian highlands, where the targets were fortified cities and the most effective weapons were the Turkic horse archers who required careful handling and substantial payment. Kavad, I didn't send him because he was available. He sent him because he was the right general for this particular terrain, this particular objective. Procopius estimates the force Kavad assembled for this invasion at approximately 30,000 men. A figure historians generally work with, while noting that Procopius was not present in Armenia and was working from reports. The actual number who reached Satala after a 126-mile march through hostile terrain, with units necessarily detached to secure supply lines, may have been somewhat lower. But the composition is not disputed. At the core of the striking power were the Savaran, the Sassanid heavy cavalry. These were not soldiers in the conventional sense. They were Persian aristocrats, men for whom warfare was a hereditary identity, armored from head to foot in scale and mail, riding horses with armored chests and heads, carrying lances, maces, swords, and bows. Ancient sources are consistent on their equipment. The Byzantine military manual, known as the Strategikon, describes them as wearing body armor and mail, armed with bows and swords. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing about an earlier generation of the same cavalry tradition, described their armor as covering the entire body with the density of a bird's feathers. Rome had been so impressed by Savaran equipment that Roman cavalry had adopted aspects of it. That was the complement of professional admiration. Supporting the Savaran were the Sunnitae, fighters from the northern Caucasus whose lands adjoined those of the Alani, described by Procopius as experienced in the region's terrain. And there were 3,000 Sabir Huns. Procopius gives this figure specifically. The Sabirs were Turkic nomads, specialists in horse archery and, unusually, in siege machinery. They were not merely mobile screens. They were technical troops who understood both the killing at distance of steppe warfare and the mechanical reduction of fortifications. Kavad had sent Mihir Miro, a genuinely combined arms force. The Perse-Armenian levies completed the army, conscripted troops from Persian-controlled Armenia who filled the numbers and performed the labor of a siege, but were not its decisive element. Procopius's view of Sassanid infantry generally is that they were, in his phrase, a crowd of pitiable peasants suited for digging and labor rather than fighting. Modern historians, including Kaveh Farrokh in his studies of the Sassanid military, note that Procopius consistently underestimates Persian infantry. But even accounting for Roman bias, the levies were not the force's cutting edge. This was a siege army. Its target was Satala. Its commander was carried in a litter, directing everything with his mind because his body had failed him. The army that would march to meet it had been built by a man who had started his career carrying a spear. He enters the historical record without biography. No birthplace, no family, no recorded origin. Historians examining the name underscore, quote underscore, to underscore, have suggested it was Gothic or Thracian, but no ancient source confirms either. What the sources do confirm is the position he held when history first noticed him. Doriphoros, a spear carrier, a personal bodyguard in the household guard of Justinian during the reign of Emperor Justin I. He was, in every documentary sense, a man who had come from nowhere. What he became in the next decade is one of the more remarkable career trajectories of the 6th century. In 527, Sittas and Belisarius, two young officers still building their reputations, were given joint command of a raid into Persian Armenia. According to Procopius, they plundered a large tract of territory and withdrew with Armenian captives. It was the kind of operation that demonstrated competence without demanding greatness. Both men were noticed. What happened next separated them. Around 528, John Malalas and Theophanes the Confessor both record. Sittas married Comito, the elder sister of the Empress Theodora, and therefore the sister-in-law of Justinian himself. This was not incidental. Theodora was the most politically active empress in Byzantine history. Her management of court alliances was systematic and deliberate. The marriage to Sittas made him a member of the innermost imperial circle overnight, bound to the ruling family not by service, but by blood. Also in 528, Justinian appointed Sittas as the first Magister Militum per Armenium, the newly created supreme command of the Armenian theater. The two events were connected. The empire's most sensitive frontier command went to the man Justinian had just made his brother-in-law. This required explanation, and the historical record provides it. According to both Malalas and Theophanes, Sittas made an administrative decision in Armenia that set him apart from every previous Roman commander in the region. He recruited his scriniari, his administrative officials, the men who managed intelligence, logistics, and local diplomacy, from the Armenian population itself. His reasoning, as the sources present it, was simple. Armenians understood Armenia. No outsider could match their knowledge of the terrain, the clan structures, the loyalties and grudges that shaped who could be trusted and who couldn't. This was not mere courtesy to the locals. It was doctrine, and it created something that would prove decisive. An intelligence network that functioned the way local intelligence always functions when it's genuine, with the granular, specific knowledge that no amount of external reconnaissance can replicate. Robert Browning, in his study of Justinian and Theodora, argues that Sittas was arguably ahead of Belisarius in the trajectory of his career until the Nika revolt of 532, and that the reason history remembers Belisarius, while Sittas remains known mainly to specialists, is largely geographical. Belisarius was in Constantinople during the revolt. He was present for the crisis that tested loyalty most visibly. Sittas was successfully campaigning against steppe nomads on the Danube. Being absent from a famous moment does strange things to a reputation. In 530, Sittas held approximately 15,000 men in the Armenian theater. At the cutting edge of this force were his bucellari, elite private household cavalry, the personal retinue that answered directly to him, trained equally in composite bow archery and heavy lance charges. These were not standard imperial troops waiting for orders from Constantinople. They were his men, shaped by his doctrine. When word reached him that Miher Miro was assembling forces near Theodosiopolis, Sittas did not move to defensive positions. He moved toward the enemy. Miher Miro was still assembling his forces. The camp was 3 days' march from the Byzantine border. His army had not yet crossed into Roman territory. By any conventional reading of military logic, Sittas's move should have been preparation, fortifying Satala, positioning his forces, waiting for the attack to materialize before responding to it. Sittas sent spies instead. According to Procopius, 2 bodyguards were dispatched to infiltrate the Persian camp and report on what was being prepared. One of them was named Dagaris. He was captured by Sabir Huns, the same nomadic auxiliaries who formed Miher Miro's mobile screen. Before he could return, the other spy made it back. He carried detailed intelligence about the Persian preparations, the scale of the force, the state of its readiness, the layout of the camp. Dagaris's fate is not recorded. He appears in the historical record once, named as a man who walked into a 30,000-man Persian camp and didn't come back. And then he's gone. What he bought with his capture, and what his partner bought with a successful return, was the information Sittas needed to act. Using the returned spy's intelligence, Sittas and Dorotheus launched a night assault on the Persian camp, while Miher Miro's army was still 3 days' march from the Byzantine border. The attack achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve. Procopius records that the Persian levies scattered into the night, that the Romans plundered the camp of supplies and weapons, and that the Byzantine force withdrew to its own lines before a coherent Persian response could be organized. The camp that had been full of provisions for a campaign was stripped of them before the campaign began. The strategic impact was measured in weeks. Miher Miro had to regroup his scattered forces, re-establish his supply situation, and reassemble the operational confidence of an army that had just been hit in the dark before it crossed a border. Every week of that delay was a week the Satala fortifications were being prepared. A week Sittas's intelligence picture was being updated. A week Miro's logistics were straining. When the Persian army finally advanced, Miro made a decision that tells us everything about the night raid's psychological impact. He bypassed Theodosiopolis entirely. The Byzantine border fortress that sat on the most direct route to Satala, the obvious first objective, the standard staging post for any advance into Roman Armenia. He went around it. The reason, though Procopius doesn't state it explicitly, is visible in the behavior. Miro was not going to put his army in front of another ambush if he could help it. He had already been hit once in a situation he thought was controlled. He wasn't going to present that opportunity again. The bypass cost him the 126-mile march through stark Armenian countryside. It cost him the logistical advantage of using Theodosiopolis as a forward base. It required him to detach units to secure his supply lines across territory he was now crossing without a base of support. By the time the Persian army came within sight of Satala's walls, it had already been shaped in subtle but real ways by a raid that had happened before the battle began. Sittas had moved toward the enemy before the enemy had finished preparing. He had used intelligence to strike first, hurt first, and redirect his opponent's advance onto unfavorable ground. He had done this while outnumbered approximately 2-1. The battlefield was waiting. Miro's army was coming. And Satala, sitting in its valley ringed by hills, was about to demonstrate why Justinian had spent the previous year rebuilding its walls. Procopius described it with the precision of someone who had read the military reports carefully. Satala lay, quote, 3, quote, and was, quote, 4, quote. That sentence is not merely topographic description. It is the explanation for everything that happened there in the summer of 530. The fortress had been a Roman military installation for centuries. The Legio 15th Apollinaris, one of Rome's 30 legions, a unit whose history stretched back to the campaigns of Mark Antony, had been garrisoned there since the time of Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century. Satala sat at the junction of the road from Trapezus on the Black Sea and the east-west routes into the interior of Asia Minor, making it the single most important military crossroads in Roman Armenia. Controlling Satala meant controlling access between the Black Sea coast and the Persian frontier. Losing Satala would have meant that Persia held the corridor. The site itself was a natural fortress in theory and a problematic one in practice. The surrounding hills created concealment and observation points that an attacker could exploit against defenders below. The walls, by the time the Iberian War began, had deteriorated to the point where their defensive value was questionable. Procopius, in his account of Justinian's building program, records that the original walls had been constructed with poor workmanship and were vulnerable to the elevated ground surrounding them. Justinian fixed this in 529. The reconstruction program at Satala was not merely a repair. It was a tactical recalculation in stone. The new walls were built with exceptional thickness and raised to a height sufficient that the surrounding hills no longer overlooked the battlements. The elevation advantage that an attacker on those hills might have exploited. The ability to shoot down into the city, to observe the garrison's positions, to use the high ground to direct fire, was negated by walls tall enough to deny it. This was engineering as strategy. Justinian had understood the battle's geometry before it happened and had built the answer into the masonry. The reconstruction was completed just months before Miro's army appeared before the walls. Turkish archaeologists have been excavating the Satala site since 2017, and the finds confirm the scale of what stood here. Among the artifacts recovered is a largely intact late Roman scale armor, a lorica squamata, the first found in this condition anywhere. The physical remnant of a Roman soldier's protection, preserved in the earth of a Turkish village, connects the modern observer to the garrison that watched Rewrote's army from those rebuilt walls. The excavation team, led by the director of the Barton University Applied Archaeology and Research Center, has unearthed artifacts spanning 5,000 years of occupation. The fortress, whose walls partly survive today around the village of Sittas, 348 inhabitants, Kelkit district, Gümüşhane province, is the same fortress where the plan Sittas was about to execute depended on terrain described by Procopius 1,500 years ago. The hills were close enough to the valley floor to provide concealment for cavalry. They were positioned such that troops descending from them would appear suddenly and at speed. The summer heat at 1,700 meters altitude, the highland Armenian summer, dry and fierce, would do the rest. Rewrote's army arrived to find exactly what it expected: a city in a plain, ringed by hills. The hills looked like assets. They were not. Most commanders facing a 2-to-1 numerical disadvantage defend. They use whatever fortifications they have. They conserve their forces. They make the attacker pay for every inch of ground. This was the logic of the situation Sittas faced. And it was not the logic he used. Procopius states what happened with the directness of someone who found it self-evidently remarkable. Sittas quote, _5 _1,000 cavalry. Hidden in the hills above the valley where 30,000 soldiers were about to deploy. This is the documented fact from which everything that followed proceeded. The 1,000 were almost certainly drawn from Sittas's Bucellari, the elite private household cavalry that formed his operational cutting edge. Procopius doesn't specify this, but the logic of the plan demands it. The men in the hills needed to be absolutely reliable, capable of maintaining concealment and discipline for hours while a vastly superior force maneuvered below them, and capable of executing a specific, timed maneuver at the moment Sittas gave the order. These were not qualities of average troops. They were qualities of men who had trained together under the same commander for years. Dorotheus remained inside the city walls with approximately 14,000 men, the bulk of the Byzantine force. His instructions, implicit in Procopius's account, were to wait. Not to sortie at the first Persian advance, not to respond to the appearance of siege preparations. To wait until the moment Sittas's maneuver had done its work, and then to act with absolute precision. The tactical patience this required should not be understated. 14,000 men watching a 30,000-man army surround their city, following orders not to respond, requires a quality of discipline that is easy to describe and genuinely difficult to maintain. What Rewrote's army saw when it arrived at Satala was the surface of the situation. A city, a garrison, hills. Standard siege procedure called for surrounding the city, cutting off supply lines, and bringing the technical assets, the Sabir siege engineers, the Sassanid equipment, to bear methodically. The Persians began deploying to do exactly this. They were professionals. They were following doctrine. They had done this before. The mathematics of the situation, as they understood it, were straightforward. 15,000 defenders, 30,000 attackers. Time and logistics on the attacker's side. The city would be surrounded, pressured, and reduced. There was no scenario in this analysis where a garrison half the army's size could produce a decisive field engagement. The hills looked like high ground for observation. They were concealment for a trap. Consider what Sittas had actually constructed. A force of 1,000 men whose entire value depended on remaining invisible until the precise moment their emergence could be misinterpreted. if the Persians detected the concealment before the trap was set. The 1,000 in the hills were exposed cavalry on a hillside with 30,000 enemies below them, and no avenue of retreat that didn't run through the Persian army. The plan worked perfectly, or it catastrophically failed. There was no middle outcome. Sittas had split his force, given the larger half instructions to wait, put the smaller half on a hillside above 30,000 enemies, and was betting the entire engagement on a cloud of dust and a question of what 30,000 soldiers would believe when they saw it. The Armenian summer at 1,700 meters produces a specific kind of heat. Dry, fierce, the kind that turns the ground to powder and makes the air above every road shimmer. When Miro's army was fully committed to its siege positions, spread across the plain below Satala's walls, Sittas gave the order. 1,000 Byzantine cavalry came over the hills. Procopius records what they did next with the specificity of someone who understood exactly why it mattered. They moved in patterns specifically designed to raise __, quote _6 _ in the summer heat. This was not an accident of movement. It was deliberate. 1,000 horses at full gallop across dry highland terrain at the right angle, crosswise to the prevailing sight lines, moving in sweeping arcs rather than straight lines, produces a dust column that scales the impression of force dramatically. What the dust cloud communicates to an observer on the valley floor below is not 1,000 horses. It communicates an indeterminate mass, probably large. From Miro's perspective, from the perspective of any Persian commander looking up from the valley floor at a massive rising dust cloud descending from the hills, the interpretation was not unreasonable. A second Byzantine army had arrived. The emperor had dispatched a relief force. The army that had been besieging the city was now itself threatened from the rear by a force of unknown but apparently substantial size. Procopius states this directly. The Persians saw the dust and concluded they were facing the main Byzantine army. Miro ordered his troops to break off the siege positions, gather their formations, and pivot to face the new threat from their rear. This was tactically rational. A general who continued a siege while an unknown enemy force closed on his rear was a general making a catastrophic error. The correct response to an unexpected force appearing behind you is exactly what Miro did. Concentrate, pivot, prepare to fight. The deception worked precisely because it exploited good military thinking. Sittas hadn't made Miro panic. He had made him respond intelligently to a false picture of reality. The moment 30,000 Persian soldiers turned their backs to the city walls, Dorotheus opened the gates. 14,000 Byzantine soldiers poured out of Satala in a sally, moving toward the rear of a Persian army that was now oriented away from them. The trap had two jaws: the descending cavalry from the hills in front, the city garrison striking from behind. Miro's army, which had arrived to conduct a methodical siege against a smaller force, now found itself receiving simultaneous pressure from two directions. Caught between opponents on terrain it had moved through but not secured, 1,000 men, a cloud of dust, the physics of highland summer, and 14,000 soldiers who had waited in disciplined silence for exactly this moment. The mathematics of the situation had just been inverted. But here's what the account of Satala usually leaves out when it reaches this point. The Persians didn't break. Procopius is unambiguous on this point, and it is one of the most important sentences in his account. Despite being caught in a pincer, attacked from the front by cavalry descending from the hills and from the rear by the city garrison, the Persian army resisted effectively due to its greater numbers. This sentence does more to explain the battle than almost anything else in the record. It tells us the fight was real. It tells us the trap, perfectly executed, did not produce an immediate collapse. It tells us that 30,000 professional soldiers, even caught in a badly compromised tactical position, possessed sufficient mass and cohesion to stabilize and hold. The Savaran, the armored Persian noble cavalry at the core of the force, were not troops that broke from surprise. The Byzantine Strategikon, the military manual that reflected centuries of Roman experience fighting Persian forces, describes them as wearing body armor and mail, armed with bows and swords, and operating with a unit cohesion built on aristocratic identity rather than merely military discipline. Their fighting quality derived from who they were, not just what they had been trained to do. Surprising a Savaran unit was not the same as defeating it. The battle became what Procopius describes as a fierce fight at close quarters. He does not specify duration. He does not give phases. What the narrative structure implies, a sustained engagement that required a dramatic individual act to break it, suggests the fighting held for a considerable period without resolution. Neither the pressure from the hills nor the pressure from the gates was sufficient, by itself or in combination, to crack 30,000 men who still outnumbered their attackers approximately 2 to 1. The mathematics of attrition in that situation favored Persia. Every hour the battle continued was an hour that weight of numbers could reassert itself. Every Byzantine soldier killed in the close quarters fighting was harder to replace than every Persian soldier killed, because the Byzantine force was half the size and couldn't absorb the same proportional losses. Sittas's trap had achieved its immediate tactical purpose. It had caught the Persian army in a compromised position and forced it to fight on unfavorable ground. What it had not done, and could not do by itself, was end the battle. Something had to change. The question was, what kind of change could break a force of this size and quality? The answer was not another cavalry maneuver. It was not a tactical innovation or a flanking movement or a fresh reserve. The Savaran could resist those things. What they couldn't resist, as it turned out, was the loss of the one object that held their sense of formation and command together. At this point in the battle, a Byzantine cavalry commander named Florentius the Thracian looked at what was happening around him and made a calculation. Procopius names him once. That is all we have. Florentius the Thracian, the cognomen quote, _10, suggesting either his ethnic origin or the region where his unit was recruited, commanded a Byzantine cavalry detachment in the fighting at Satala. His rank is not specified. His biography is not recorded. Before the summer of 530, he is absent from every source. After it, he is equally absent. He exists in the historical record for exactly one sentence, which Procopius places at the turning point of the battle as if it explains everything, because it does. Procopius records that Florentius led his unit in a charge directly into the Persian center. The target was not a tactical position. It was not a line of troops or a siege engine or a flanking cavalry formation. It was Mihr Mihro's personal battle standard. The significance of that target requires some context. In Sassanid military practice, the drafsh, the banner of a commander, was not merely decorative. It was the visual focal point of the entire formation's command communication. On a 6th century battlefield, where no radio and no field telephone existed, where the noise of close quarters fighting made verbal orders unreliable at range, a commander's standard was the point by which units oriented themselves. It told soldiers where the command center was, which direction the general intended, whether the formation was holding. When a Sassanid unit saw its commander's standard moving, it moved. When the standard was stationary, it held. The drafsh was, in a functional sense, the nervous system of the formation's coherence. Florentius fought his way to the standard-bearer. He seized it. According to Procopius, he managed to capture Mihero's battle standard. The flag went down, whether thrown deliberately or lost in the immediate violence of the moment. The sources don't specify. What they specify is what came immediately after. Florentius was killed, cut down by Persian guards defending the standard. He was dead within moments of taking it. He had ridden into the center of 30,000 enemies. He had taken what he came for. He had died for it. And it worked. Procopius states the effect without elaboration. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 12, underscore, underscore. The formations that had been holding, resisting effectively, per Procopius's own earlier characterization, against the Byzantine pincer, began to come apart. Units that had been anchored by the visual certainty of the command standard were suddenly without it. Mihero was still alive, still in his litter, still capable of issuing orders. But the visible sign of his authority, the focal point that had been organizing Persian resistance throughout the fight, was gone from the field. The Persian army retreated to its camp. This is the moment the intro promised to explain. A man who calculated that his life was worth a piece of cloth. What Florentius understood, apparently clearly enough to act on it without hesitation, was that the battle's physical terms were not going to resolve it. The Persians had enough men to hold the ground. But the Sassanid military's cohesion was not purely physical. It was psychological, organized around symbols of authority and the certainty those symbols communicated. Remove the symbol, and you remove the certainty. Remove the certainty from men who had been absorbing pressure for hours, and you transform resistance into doubt. Transform doubt into fear. And 30,000 men become 30,000 individuals making individual decisions about where they'd rather be. Florentius appears to have understood all of this. Procopius doesn't tell us that. The act tells us. The Persian army retreated to its camp in good enough order that the Byzantines didn't pursue. That detail matters more than it might appear. Procopius states the outcome plainly. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 13, underscore, underscore, underscore 2. Separate military decisions are embedded in that sentence. Mihero chose not to renew the assault. Sittas and Dorotheus chose not to pursue. Each of these decisions reflects a clear-eyed assessment of what had actually happened. The Persian army still existed. It had retreated, not been destroyed. The siege had failed, not the force that conducted it. Mihero had 30,000 men, or whatever number remained after the previous day's fighting, which Procopius does not specify, in reasonable fighting condition. His supply situation was damaged, his operational confidence was shaken, his battle standard had been taken, and his army had experienced something it had apparently not experienced often, a tactical situation from which there was no clean exit. But this was not annihilation. The decision not to renew the assault is therefore psychologically revealing in a way that goes beyond simple battlefield logic. Mihero had options. The city had not fallen. The Byzantine force was half his size. He could have reorganized, restored formation, and tried again the following day. He didn't. The Byzantine military blog, in its analysis of this engagement, suggests the non-pursuit reflects that the Persian force was still coherent and formidable enough in retreat that chasing it would have been dangerous. And by the same logic, Mihero's decision to leave suggests a judgment that the operational situation at Satala had been permanently compromised, not merely temporarily interrupted. A general who thought he could still take the city in the next engagement stays. Miro left. This was not, it must be said, the end of Miro. He reappears in Persian command roles in subsequent campaigns, indicating that whatever judgment Kavad I formed about his performance at Satala was not the judgment of a general who had failed through incompetence. The terrain was wrong. The intelligence had been defeated by Sittas's Armenian network before the battle began. The deception had worked. These were not failures of military ability. They were the consequences of being outmaneuvered by someone who had spent 2 years building a specific kind of intelligence advantage for exactly this kind of engagement. What the withdrawal also reveals is the nature of the Byzantine victory. Satala was not a battle of annihilation. No chronicle records the rout of a fleeing Persian army, no pursuit into the mountains, no masses of prisoners. The victory was precise and limited. The siege was broken, the Persian army was turned around, and Miro's operational momentum, which had been building since the start of the campaign, was stopped. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly what a 15,000-man force defending Armenian territory needed to accomplish against 30,000 attackers. The dust had settled. Satala still stood, and the political consequences of what had just happened were beginning to move through the Armenian highlands faster than horses. 3 years before the summer of 530, 2 brothers from a noble Perse-Armenian family had defeated Sittas in the field. Procopius records the earlier encounter without drama. In 527, Sittas and Belisarius had made a raid into Persian Armenia that ended with Narses and Arrhetius, 2 Armenian noblemen fighting in Persian service, confronting them and gaining the advantage. It was not a catastrophic defeat. It was a battlefield reversal in a minor engagement. But it was a defeat, and Procopius names the men who inflicted it. In the summer of 530, immediately following the Byzantine victory at Satala, those same 2 brothers, Arrhetius and Narses, defected from the Persian Empire to Byzantium. They brought their mother with them. Modern historians, drawing on the prosopography of the later Roman Empire and the Encyclopedia Ironica's entry on the Kamsarakan family, identify these brothers as almost certainly members of the ancient Kamsarakan house, one of the great Armenian noble families of Parthian origin, with a history in the region stretching back centuries. Their defection was not the act of desperate men running from a losing side. It was the calculated judgment of established noble warriors who had assessed the strategic situation and concluded that the empire they had been serving was no longer the better bet. Procopius records that they came to Byzantine lines with their mother and were received by the imperial Sacellarius Narses, himself a Perse-Armenian by birth. A detail that explains why he was the natural point of contact for Armenian nobles crossing to the Roman side. Narses received them __quote _15 __. This was investment, not charity. The Kamsarakan brothers brought military skill, regional legitimacy, clan networks, and the symbolic weight of a family that had beaten Byzantine commanders in the field, now choosing to fight for Byzantium. These were things money couldn't manufacture. Their brother Isaac, the third of the 3, went further still. He surrendered the fortress of Bolam, a key Persian staging post near Theodosiopolis, by the simplest and most effective method available. He opened a gate from the inside for Roman infiltrators. A fortress that would have required a siege to take changed hands without a battle. All 3 brothers died in Byzantine service. Narses was killed in 543 in Perse-Armenia. Isaac was captured by the Ostrogothic king Totila in Italy and executed in 546. Arrhetius was killed in an ambush in 552 while fighting in Illyricum. The empire they chose for themselves consumed them as completely as the empire they left would have. But they made the choice, and they made it in the summer of 530, in the immediate wake of a battle that had changed the arithmetic of Persian influence in the Caucasus. The Kamsarakan defection was the political earthquake. What happened at Pharangium was the aftershock, and it struck Persia's treasury in a way that mattered more than any territory. In a steep canyon somewhere in the Armenian highlands, the exact location has not been definitively established by modern archaeology. There was a fortress called Pharangium that sat above a gold mine. The mine had been operated under license from Kavad I by a local administrator named Simeon. When the war reached his corner of the highlands, Simeon made a decision that Procopius records with what feels like genuine admiration for its audacity. Simeon surrendered Pharangium to Rome. Then he refused to give the gold to anyone. Procopius quotes this situation with specific detail. Simeon quote _16 _. His reasoning, as Procopius presents it, was that he had decided to deprive Kavad of the revenue. But he saw no reason why that should benefit the Romans either. The Romans, Procopius notes, were content. Depriving Persia of the income was sufficient. Quote _17 _. The significance of this is not immediately visible unless you understand what that gold was paying for. Scholar S. Vryonis, in his analysis of Byzantine gold mining, documents that disputes over the mines in this border region were the cause of armed conflict between Persia and Byzantium at least 4 separate times across more than a century. In 421–22, under the Emperor Anastasius, in 530, and again in 534. These were not marginal disputes. They were structural conflicts over a resource that both empires needed for the same purpose: paying nomadic mercenaries. The Sabir Huns, who had formed Mir Mihro's mobile screen at Satala, the 3,000 specialists that Kavad had included specifically for their combined archery and siege engineering capabilities, were in Persian service because Persia paid them. The payment came from gold. The gold came, in significant part, from mines like Pharangium. Losing the mine didn't destroy the Persian military immediately. What it did was begin eroding the financial mechanism by which Persia sustained the nomadic relationships that gave its army its mobile striking power in the Caucasus. The Eternal Peace of 532, which formally ended the Iberian War, required the Romans to return Pharangium to Persia as part of its territorial restoration clauses. The Romans eventually violated this provision. The violation triggered another Persian declaration of war in 534. The single mine that Simeon had refused to hand over to either empire kept generating conflict after both Simeon and Mir Mihro were dead, after Kavad I was dead. After the peace that was supposed to resolve everything had already been broken. The Battle of Satala produced 3 cascading consequences. The Kamsarakan defections changed the human architecture of Byzantine command in the Caucasus. The fall of Pharangium began undermining the financial architecture of Persian military power in the region. And the fortress of Bolam, delivered by Isaac opening a gate from the inside, removed a critical Persian staging post from the operational map. None of these consequences required another battle. They were the aftermath of one morning's fighting spreading outward. Satala was a decisive Byzantine victory. It did not end the war. This matters for how we understand what the battle actually accomplished. The narrative of 2 great empires fighting to exhaustion tends to flatten the complexity of the actual sequence, treating each battle as a stepping stone toward an inevitable conclusion. The reality in 531 was less tidy. Satala had broken Persian momentum in Armenia. Belisarius's victory at Dara earlier in 530 had broken Persian momentum in Mesopotamia. But the Sassanid Empire was not broken. On April 19, 531, at the Battle of Callinicum, Persian and Lakhmid forces defeated Belisarius, the same general who had crushed Persia at Dara, who had become, in the aftermath of that victory, perhaps the most celebrated military commander in the Byzantine world, was now beaten in the field. He was brought before a commission of inquiry on his return and dismissed from his post. Iberian War Wikipedia, drawing on Procopius, records that Persian general Azarethes was also stripped of his rank, because despite the victory at Callinicum, his army had taken heavy losses and failed to capture any significant fortification. Both sides had lost a general in the immediate aftermath of one battle. The war was grinding both empires toward exhaustion simultaneously. September of 531 brought the event that changed the diplomatic mathematics more decisively than any battle. Kavad I died. He had reigned for more than 4 decades. He had initiated the Iberian War partly to secure the succession of his favorite son, and that son, Khosrau I, now inherited without significant opposition. The irony ran deep. The war Kavad had started to protect Khosrau's position ended up being resolved by Khosrau himself. At terms Kavad might have found acceptable 7 years earlier if the barbarian adoption had not poisoned the diplomatic atmosphere irreparably. Khosrau needed to consolidate. His domestic position required attention, rival factions, court politics, the perennial challenge of a new Persian king establishing undisputed authority. War on the western frontier was expensive and inconclusive. He was open to peace. Justinian was equally ready. His strategic ambitions were oriented westward. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa, the Ostrogothic control of Italy, the reconquest of the Western Mediterranean that would define his reign. All of that required a stable eastern frontier. The Eternal Peace was signed in September of 532 on terms that both sides could accept. All occupied territories returned, Rome to make a one-time payment of 11,000 pounds of gold, Iberia to remain in Persian hands, and Iberians already in Roman territory to be allowed to stay. The peace lasted less than 8 years. In 540, Khosrau I, the man who had signed it, broke it. The Near East would not stabilize for another century, when the Arab conquests of the 630s made the entire question of Roman-Persian dominance irrelevant in less than a decade. But in 532, both empires had what they needed. And what made that possible? What gave Justinian enough leverage to negotiate from something resembling strength despite the loss at Callinicum was the convergence of 2 victories in the same year on 2 different fronts that had demonstrated Byzantine military capability in a way the previous 4 years had not. The standard history of Justinian's reign tends to focus on the great set pieces. Belisarius conquering the Vandals in 9 months, the long, brutal campaigns of the Gothic War in Italy, the Hagia Sophia rising above Constantinople as the physical statement of imperial ambition. These are the stories with obvious grandeur. Satala is not one of those stories. It was a single afternoon's engagement at a fortress in the Armenian highlands against an army that turned around and went home the next day. What it validated was the architecture that made everything else possible. Sittas had proved 3 things simultaneously at Satala that Justinian needed proved. The new Armenian command structure worked. Unified authority over the northern theater, consolidated under a single commander with genuine operational independence, had produced a coordinated intelligence and battle plan that no fragmented command could have executed. The Armenian integration model worked. The scriniarii recruited from the local population had generated the intelligence, the spy mission, the night raid, the knowledge of terrain and Persian preparations that shaped the engagement before it began. And the rebuilt walls worked. Justinian's investment in Satala's fortifications, completed months before the Persian arrival, had given Dorotheus and 14,000 men a platform to hold while Sittas's deception developed. Together with Dara, where Belisarius had demonstrated that Byzantine forces could defeat a numerically superior Persian army in open field engagement, Satala demonstrated that the same was true in the terrain-constrained, intelligence-dependent warfare of the Armenian theater. The two victories in 530 didn't mean Persia was finished. They meant Persia was no longer operating from a position of accumulated momentum. Kavad's negotiating position entering any peace discussion was materially weaker than it had been a year earlier, and both sides knew it. What the Kamsarakan defection added to this was a demonstration of something harder to quantify. That Sittas's Armenian integration model had cultural and social depth beyond its immediate military application. The Kamsarakan brothers had come over because they judged Byzantium the winning side, but also because Sittas had spent 2 years demonstrating that Byzantium valued Armenian commanders rather than merely using them. Arrhetius, Narses, and Isaac went on to hold commands in Egypt, Palestine, Italy, and Illyricum. Armenian noble houses became a structural feature of Byzantine military leadership across the following generations. The Encyclopedia Ironica's entry on the Kamsarakan family documents their service across the entire span of Justinian's reign. Satala was one of the first demonstrations that this model, treating frontier peoples as partners rather than auxiliaries, could produce military dividends that outlasted the battle that demonstrated it. Robert Browning's assessment of Sittas, as the biographer of Justinian and Theodora observed, points to a larger truth about how history distributes its attention. Sittas won a battle in Armenia. Belisarius won battles in Africa and Italy in front of witnesses who wrote extensively about them. The geography of fame and the geography of significance are not the same geography. Satala sits at 1,700 meters in the Armenian highlands, in a village of 348 people that most historians of this period have never visited. The battle that happened there helped make Justinian's western campaigns possible. The man who won it is known mainly to specialists. His fortress is still there, his walls are partly standing, and archaeologists are still pulling Roman soldiers' armor from the earth beneath it. Every fact in this account, every tactical detail, every sequence of events, every named individual, comes from a single source. Procopius of Caesarea, secretary and legal advisor to Belisarius, wrote about the Battle of Satala in Book 1, Chapter 15 of his History of the Wars. He did not witness the engagement. He was in Mesopotamia with Belisarius. At the time, the battle was fought in Armenia. The Byzantine military blog, in its analysis of this account, notes that Procopius's Satala narrative is observably less detailed than his description of Dara, where he was present as an eyewitness, and attributes this to the obvious fact that he was working from reports rather than from observation. This has consequences for what we know and what we cannot know. Procopius gives us no casualty figures, not a number, not an estimate, not even a general characterization of how many soldiers died on either side. He tells us the outcome, the mechanism, the sequence, and then moves on. Any specific casualty figure applied to the Battle of Satala, any claim that hundreds or thousands died, is not history. It is invention filling a silence that Procopius himself left. He gives us the battle's duration only by implication. The fighting was sustained enough to require an extraordinary act to break it. That's all the text supports. He gives us Miro's actions, but not his perspective. The old general in the litter, the most vivid human image in the entire account, is visible only from the outside. What he thought when the dust cloud appeared on the hills, what he understood when the gates of Satala opened behind his lines, what he felt watching his standard disappear from the field. None of this is accessible. Procopius records a Persian military perspective that is purely behavioral. The interior life of the campaign's losing commander is permanently unavailable. And then there is Florentius. Procopius names him, describes his act in one sentence, notes his death, and never mentions him again. Florentius the Thracian, who commanded a cavalry unit at Satala, who rode into 30,000 enemies to steal a battle standard, who succeeded and died immediately, has no biography in the sources. No family, no unit designation, no career before or after the single moment that preserved his name. He exists in historical memory for exactly as long as it takes Procopius to describe what he did. And then, he is gone. This is what the historical record does to most of the people who shaped it. Fame attaches to generals and emperors and events grand enough to generate multiple witnesses. The men who perform the specific, consequential acts that turn battles, the acts that require a kind of courage or calculation or specific knowledge that is difficult to explain, tend to appear in sources for one sentence and vanish. Florentius saved the battle. History forgot his first name. What Procopius recorded at Satala, imperfectly secondhand, in a chapter most readers of his 8-volume history have likely skimmed, is enough to reconstruct the battle's essential structure, enough to document the deception, verify the charge, trace the consequences. The silences around what he recorded are their own kind of testimony to the limits of ancient military history, to what gets preserved and what doesn't, and to the gap between what happened and what we can ever fully know about it. The village of Sadak has 348 inhabitants. It sits in the Kelkit district of Gümüşhane province in northeastern Turkey, approximately 150 kilometers south of Trabzon. The ancient Trapezus, the Black Sea port that Satala was built to connect to the interior of the Roman East. The walls of the legionary fortress partly survive, surrounding the village on the sloping floor of the Sadak-Chaya Valley. The hills that Procopius described, the hills that tower around the plain, are still there, still visible, still exactly the terrain that Sittas used. Turkish archaeologists have been excavating the site since 2017. Among the finds, a largely intact lorica squamata, late Roman scale armor, the first found in this condition anywhere. Physical evidence of a Roman soldier's equipment, preserved in the ground beneath a modern Turkish village, connecting the present to the garrison that watched Miro's army from rebuilt walls 15 centuries ago. The excavations have produced artifacts spanning 5,000 years of occupation. And the team's director has described plans for a visitable site and museum that would make Satala one of Turkey's significant Roman military monuments. Elsewhere, in the British Museum in London, there is a larger-than-life bronze head. The Satala Aphrodite, found in a farmer's field outside Sadak in 1872, is a Hellenistic sculpture of exceptional quality that was here when the Legio 15th Apollinaris was here, when Justinian's engineers rebuilt the walls, when Sittas led 1,000 cavalry over the hills above the valley. It was found in a field because someone buried it or dropped it, or it simply survived the collapse of the structures that once held it. It is in London now. The fortress it came from is still in Turkey, waiting for better funding and more time. The battle that happened here in the summer of 530 sits at the intersection of everything that makes Justinian's reign worth studying at full complexity. The twin victories at Dara and Satala gave Justinian the negotiating leverage that produced the eternal peace of 532. That peace freed Byzantine military resources for Belisarius's conquest of the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in 533. For the long, brutal campaigns of the Gothic War that partially restored Italy and Rome to Roman rule. For the partial reconquest of the Western Mediterranean that Justinian would call the renovation of the empire. None of this was possible without a stable eastern frontier. The eastern frontier required a peace. The peace required leverage. The leverage came, in part, from a cloud of dust above a valley in the Armenian highlands. Historians examining this causal chain are careful, appropriately, to note that Satala was one factor among several, that Dara mattered, that Kavut's death mattered, that Khosrau's domestic needs mattered. The battle was not the single cause of everything that followed, but it was a link in a chain whose absence would have changed the chain's strength, and the chain's strength mattered. The hills around Sadak still produce dust on a dry summer day. The walls still stand, partly around a village that has forgotten the battle that happened there. And somewhere under that field, there are more suits of armor, more artifacts, more physical remnants of the garrison that held Satala, while 1,000 cavalry came down from the hills above them. They're still finding pieces of it. The old man in the litter watched his army retreat. Mihiro carried on servants' shoulders, unable to ride, directing 30,000 men with his mind because his legs had long since failed him. Had done everything a capable general could do. He had assembled a superior force for the precise terrain he was being sent to fight in. He had marched it through hostile country to its objective. He had deployed it correctly around a city that should, by every measure of military arithmetic, have fallen. And then a cloud of dust had appeared on a hillside, and a Thracian officer had stolen his flag, and 30,000 men had turned around. He would fight again. Mihiro reappears in Persian command roles in subsequent campaigns, which tells us Kavad's judgment of him was the judgment of a professional who had been outmaneuvered, not a failure who had been disgraced. The Sassanid Empire continued. The Iberian War continued. Callinicum happened, and the eternal peace of 532, which Khosrau I signed. The same Khosrau whose proposed adoption had started everything, required the Romans to pay 11,000 pounds of gold for the privilege of stable borders. History rarely delivers clean endings, but in the summer of 530, at a fortress in the Armenian highlands whose walls had been rebuilt months earlier by an emperor who understood its geometry, 3 things happened that mattered beyond the tactical result. Sittas proved that an intelligence network built from local knowledge could shape a battle before it began. Florentius proved that the object an army believes in can matter more than the army's size. And Simeon proved that the man controlling the gold mine doesn't have to be the man winning the war. The Kamsarakan brothers who defected in the battle's wake, men who had beaten Sittas 3 years earlier, died eventually in Byzantine service in Italy and Persarmenia and Illyricum, far from the Armenian hills where they had made their calculation. The gold mine that Simeon refused to surrender generated wars for decades after both men were dead. Satala's rebuilt walls still stand, partly, around a village of 348 people. Florentius, the Thracian, has no monument there. He has no monument anywhere. He rode into 30,000 enemies, took what he came for, and died. What he understood about what holds an army together, about the difference between physical force and the belief that organizes physical force, was not recorded by Procopius. It was demonstrated. That's the thing about the dust at Satala. The dust was never the weapon. The dust was the medium through which a belief was communicated, that a larger army was coming, that the situation had changed, that what was true a moment ago was no longer true. And once 30,000 soldiers believed that, the battle was already decided. The fighting was just confirmation. Rewrote understood this too. He was a professional who had spent a career learning what soldiers believe and why it matters. He just hadn't seen it done quite like that. With quite that economy of means, 1,000 men, a summer hillside, and the specific knowledge of what dust looks like when you need it to look like an army. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the battles that shaped empires without making the front page of any history book, the commanders whose names you've never heard who built the foundations of things you do know, subscribe and turn on notifications. The stories are all real. The dust is always in the details.